I'll start with a little background on Doug Engelbart, and most people have never heard of him before. If you have heard of him, chances are it's because of his invention of the mouse, which by 2008 was celebrated as 1 billion mice sold by Logitech. So the impact on society was quite amazing. However, this was just a byproduct of his work. If you're lucky, you may have heard of him as the producer of the Mother of All Demos, where he gave the presentation in front of 1,000 people at a conference where the world debut of the computer mouse and online on-screen editing, shared screen teleconferencing, hypermedia, groupware. And I think it's pretty safe to say, besides being the father of the mouse and groupware, that he's the father of networked information. However, as Paul Saffo would say, who's a futurist from Stanford, these were mere baubles compared with the work that he had set out to accomplish. So let's do a little background to see what he was really thinking. The story in a nutshell, beginning all the way back in 1950, this is when he first became engaged with my mother, it caused him to go into a little midlife crisis to reevaluate his life's goals. And what he settled on was how could he maximize the effect of his career in the service of mankind. And when he thought further about how he would do that and what that would look like, he realized if you look at all the ways that people are trying to improve the human condition anywhere on the planet, there's a lot in common on the way that they go about that, how they gain comprehension of the problems, whether they're working on a cure for cancer or sending someone to the moon. How do they go about that? What do they need to learn? What do they need to know? How do they advance their knowledge? And how do they come up with a solution? So he realized that if somebody worked on how you could get better at that, then everybody in the planet who's working to make the world a better place would be much more effective, and they'd be able to solve problems that could never be solved before. So he went to work and over the next 12 years and studied this quite comprehensively and ended up with a 160-page report called The Conceptual Framework for Augmenting the Human Intellect. And this is where he fleshed out a research program for how you would go about making this a reality. He called it Augmenting the Human Intellect. The way he defined augmenting human intellect was how we could be much more effective at approaching a complex problem, gaining the comprehension necessary, deriving solutions, and enacting the solutions. And not only to be able to do that, but to be able to do it faster, to be smarter at it, to be able to do it more cost effectively, and also to have major breakthroughs in areas where there previously would have been no hope for a solution. He had the realization that computers could augment our thinking, and this became a big part of his research. Not just to automate our knowledge work, but to actually augment our thinking. What goes on in the mind and how can you really support and facilitate that? What goes on in the mind of groups and into the collective intellect? How computers come to bear on that. He thought about concepts in the mind, the way we think, the way knowledge happens in our mind. It's a collection of concepts and connecting the dots in the concepts, and then connecting the dots between the people working to gain knowledge, working on solutions together, and came up with this thought vectors and concept space. So it's not just about sharing information in the form of documents and that type of thing, but really reaching into the mind and how we can better facilitate and communicate between the people who really need to put their minds together, and how do you facilitate that? And he realized too that the world's going to be speeding up and problems are going to become a lot more complex. So how can we accelerate the progress toward getting these new capabilities for humanity? And he devised a strategy for doing that, which he called a bootstrapping strategy. As a result of this report, he got his initial funding from NASA to start doing the research that he proposed. So he got together, he hired a handful of software guys and engineers, put them all in a room together and said, okay, you guys are the first subjects of the experiment. This is an experiment that we're running on how can we become more effective and augmenting the human intellect. And so how do we do that for ourselves? We're going to be trying to launch this, and how do we make ourselves smarter in the process? So he ran this like an expedition, like the Lewis and Clark expedition. It wasn't just, we're going to build something for those people out there. We need this too. So first we'll use it on ourselves. So getting a computer and some terminals together in 1963, that's what that looked like. Pretty soon, though, that they were able to get some of the capabilities going, and they got their first display terminal. This cost about $80,000, and it didn't even work the way they needed to. They also weren't happy with the pointing devices, and so my father invented the mouse. And it was the most effective. And it's still the most effective. It's still the most accurate and fast device for pointing. By 1967, they had groupware going, supporting meetings. They had all kinds of new processes for how they work together. And this was a big part of the research to not just look at the technology, not just develop new tools, but to develop new tools in the context of how you're going to work together a lot more effectively. So they experimented with all the human aspects of this, the human side of the equation. What are the procedures and methodologies and the paradigms? Why do we do things the way we do? So it's very experimental all the way around. And you would think that this could slow you down, but in fact, because of the strategic bootstrapping that they employed in walking their talk, that they actually were able to accelerate the progress toward their goal. So with a handful of programmers, by 1968, they had all of this stuff working operationally in their lab. This is how they designed their software. This is how they implemented everything. This is how they documented everything. They shared it. They had networked information all throughout the system. And then by 1968, they were ready to demonstrate this to the world. So this was the demo, the mother of all demos, which was just sort of a blip on their radar screen. It was just a snapshot of a point in time of their expeditionary research. By 1969, they were the second host to be connected to the ARPANET, which became the internet. So they were on the ground floor of networking, and the ability to go out on a network and network to other groups was seen as being extremely important to this research, and this was the way to go. So by the end of 1969, there were 4 hosts on the network, and now it's the internet, so everybody's on it. This enabled online communities. So Doug Engelbart supported the first network information center for the ARPANET, the first network user communities online, and on into the 1990s, he was carrying forward this vision and mission, and had coined the term collective IQ as a measure of our collective intelligence, and transitioned from calling it augmenting the human intellect to boosting our collective IQ. We started the Doug Engelbart Institute a little before that to carry forward his work in a neutral platform outside of industry. So, and what's important in all this is not the technology per se, although the technology obviously had incredible implication throughout the world, but the strategic approach, the eating their own dog food, the taking into account the human side of the equation as well as the tool, and finding a way to speed up the co-evolution of those two, gave them an incredible power in their research for breakthrough innovation, one breakthrough innovation after the other, and not just isolated clever tricks, but in an integrated environment where they lived and breathed the new future of work, the future of learning, the future of research. So at the crux of it was having an evolvable prototype, which was sort of starting with the minimum viable prototype and then building it from there based on experience, based on learning. So it's a build, test, learn, user-centric build, test, learn. Where all this leaves us with the Doug Engelbart Institute is an incredible special collection of curated archives from decades of work, as you can imagine, 1,000 linear feet of archives that are in collaboration with Stanford University Special Collections, Computer History Museum, the Internet Archive, and so forth. And part of that project is to cull out and bring forward some of the gems of video materials and writings, because all of this is still so pertinent today and so much more relevant than ever before. How do we boost our collective IQ? This is all going toward what we're just announcing is the Engelbart Academy online, where you can come and watch the videos and learn from the master. And then in addition to this, I've distilled all this thinking into a 5-point strategy for how do you do something like this in your own project teams, in your own initiatives, to get your group out on the frontier and explore and get that kind of bootstrapping power with the same kind of thinking that drove this work. So I called this 5-point strategy bootstrapping brilliance, because the idea is that as you're boosting the collective IQ of your team or organization, you're going to be getting more brilliant outcomes, you're going to be creating more brilliant organizations and more brilliant businesses, and ultimately a more brilliant world. So I called it bootstrapping brilliance. Let's really quickly go through the 5 points. And this is just to queue up, because you'll see as Gardner shares more about the ThoughtVectors class, how these came into play as they progressed. Network Your Innovators is about who's going to be on your team, not just the usual suspects, but because you're going to be running more like an expedition on the frontier, you need expedition quality people who don't need to sleep in a feather bed. Who are the people who can be part of the solution? It's going to be a multidisciplinary project, and so who needs to be part of the solution? And how are you going to organize and network yourselves to be a kind of working community that can accomplish these goals together? Cultivating the collective IQ, how do you put your minds together and leverage your collective smarts, developing a shared vision, developing your shared mission? How are you going to think through these problems together? What are your processes? What are the tools that you're going to use? What's the environment that you're going to be capturing the products of your work so that it's available to everyone? You know, the mission of your group is that it's not just about developing a new tool and fielding it out there. It's about looking at the whole capability. That's where you're going to get your real power, looking at the whole capability, the human side and the tool side, what all you can change, what are all the aspects of the capability that are candidates for improvement. And then accelerating the evolution is that you're looking at the human side and the tool side. How do you accelerate progress toward your goals? Taking the human and the tool side into account, how do you progress onto the frontier? And then walking your talk, which is what we discussed before. Walking your talk, you are eating your own dog food. You're doing this for yourselves as well as your, target population. So when I met Gardner and he proposed doing this class, you can see how it was just right on with what were our mission and vision. Not only the vision that he wanted to carry into the class curriculum, but the approach, the expeditionary approach to how to even design this class and grow it into something that's very novel, very breakthrough innovation. And also afforded us the opportunity to sponsor the Engelbart Scholar Award Program. So that's basically the model that my father developed through all his decades of work to inform basically networked knowledge, networked information, and networked learning, and to inform the tool development and the design of tools and the design of a supportive environment. So what does that ecosystem look like of people, tools, knowledge, all interacting to advance the knowledge, to advance our thinking, to advance our learning in the deepest and most meaningful way?